I'd like to start today by thanking each one of you who has become a patron of Cowboy Crossroads over on Patreon.com. Patreon is a platform that allows you to provide monthly support to creative endeavors that you admire and value, and in exchange for that, you get a few perks. The support that you folks have provided has allowed me to do some traveling to collect interviews so that I can continue to release new episodes on at least a monthly basis. So thank you for being a patron, and if you're interested in becoming a patron, head over to patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. That's patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. I also want to say thank you to the folks who have made donations on the website, and to everyone who has encouraged me with emails, iTunes reviews, comments on social media, and other messages. I read every single word, and I appreciate it more than I can say. So thank you all for supporting Cowboy Crossroads. Back in the year of 2000, I was first invited to perform at the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada. I actually received the invitation in the spring of 1999 after someone from the Western Folklife Center heard me perform at the Texas gathering in Alpine. But it was in January of 2000 when I first traveled to Elko to perform. At the time, I was living on a little place out east of DuBois, Wyoming, not far from the old Double Diamond Ranch. As I recall, I drove to the airport in Riverton, Wyoming, and caught a flight to Denver where I had a layover, and then caught another flight to Salt Lake City where I could catch a bus to Elko. If you've ever spent much time in an airport, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say that you sometimes notice an odd-looking person that stands out from the crowd. While I was in the Denver airport, I noticed a man who looked out of place. He had a gray mustache and was wearing a sports coat and a short-brimmed hat. He kind of looked like a character out of a Will James novel. I probably would never have thought of this man again, but I noticed that he was boarding the same flight I was boarding to Salt Lake City. When I arrived in Salt Lake City, there was someone waiting with a sign for cowboy poets who were traveling to Elko. Many of the performers were riding on a bus together, and everyone was gathering at a certain point in the airport. Well, I didn't meet him, but I noticed that the odd-looking man in the short-brimmed hat was part of our group. I remember that he was talking very loudly and couldn't seem to hear anybody. I figured that his ears had stopped up on the flight. The bus ride to Elko was about 3.5 hours, and I ended up sitting next to the legendary old-time cowboy singer Glenn Orland. I was already a big fan of Glenn's, and that was the perfect introduction to the cowboy poetry gathering. When the bus pulled into Elko, we made stops at all of the various hotels and motels where the different performers were staying. It seemed that my motel was the very last stop. I was staying at the Midtown Motel in downtown Elko, and the only other person left on the bus was the odd-looking man in the short-brimmed hat. Sure enough, he got out at the Midtown as well. We both walked into the office to check in, and after some confusion, we learned that we were sharing a room for the weekend. Now, back in those days, the gathering would have some performers share a room to save on expenses, but somehow me and the man in the short-brimmed hat did not know that until we arrived at the Midtown Motel. We finally got acquainted, and I learned that this man I had been seeing all day was a rancher, cowboy, poet, and songwriter from the sandhills of Nebraska named Howard Parker. He was an authentic Western character, and I remember that he came into the room much later than I did every night, and he was constantly smoking his hand-rolled cigarettes in the room. He made me feel welcomed at that first gathering and encouraged my interest in traditional cowboy songs and poetry. Howard Parker died in 2004, and I don't believe I ever saw him again after that gathering. In 2006, Howard was inducted into the Nebraska Sandhills Cowboy Hall of Fame. Howard gave me a book of his poetry that weekend in Elko that's entitled Poetry and Prose from Horse Thief Crossing. I'd like to start today's show with a poem from that book entitled Old-Time Ranch Women. Well, you've heard of old-time ranch women, and I've known some in my days. They could take on any cowboy and beat him 40 ways. The menfolk in their life had run off or up and died, but they held the place together, raised a family on the side. They battled all the elements, the sun and wind and snow, and their clothes would make old Rawhide look like a style show. They weren't much for amusement, frivolity, or fun, and they didn't have no quitting time, just worked till they got done. But now I've watched 'em on the silver screen and seen 'em on TV, and their contribution to the West is a bafflement to me. 'Cause at most any situation, they just stand around and weep, and they couldn't find an Angus cow out in a flock of sheep. She wears a brand new Stetson tilted back on curly locks, and it's shaped just the way it was the day it came out of the box. Her blouse has just one button and is sittin' mighty low. She's got things some girls would kill for that are just about to show. Well, the ranch is grave in danger. She just might lose it all. Crooked sheriff, crooked banker, they're foreclosing in the fall. Then comin' loping across the sagebrush, mounted on a fiery steed, is John Wayne to the rescue of this damsel in dire need. There will be fistfights then and gunplay, while the maid is overjoyed to be saved from situations that a half-wit could avoid. There is a happy ending. John saves the ranch, you know, and they ride off into the sunset at the ending of the show. But from the ranch women I have known, I've just got one thing to say. They damn sure didn't need John Wayne. He'd have just got in the way. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Teresa Jordan. Teresa Jordan is an artist, a writer, and a storyteller. She's the author of several books, including a memoir about growing up on a Wyoming ranch entitled Riding the White Horse Home, and a book of oral history interviews with ranch women entitled Cowgirls, Women of the American West. Her most recent book is The Year of Living Virtuously, Weekends Off. Teresa has been awarded a literary fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Western Heritage Award from the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. I sat down with Teresa outside of her studio in Virgin, Utah, and recorded this interview. I apologize for some of the background noise in the recording, but I hope it makes you feel like you are sitting on the patio with me and Teresa. The first section will begin with Teresa reading a short excerpt from her book, Riding the White Horse Home. Here's Teresa Jordan.
A few years before my great-aunt Marie died, I visited her at a ranch on the North Fork of Chugwater Creek, and we went out early in the morning to feed the bulls. Marie's eyesight had been failing for years. She was practically blind. I drove the pickup through the center of the meadow, and the bulls gathered around for their taste of hay and cottonseed cake. Marie pointed to a hill in the distance. "There's a couple up there that don't seem so interested," she said. "We better kick them down." I looked where she pointed. "I think those are rocks, Marie." "No," she said, "they're bulls." Marie was blind enough that she could no longer recognize neighbors at the post office, and just that morning she'd mistaken the baler for a pickup. "I really think those are rocks, Marie." "Never been any rocks there before," she said. To indulge her, I pointed the long bed pickup up the hill. I could see that the dark spots were just rocks, but I held my tongue. Marie would see soon enough. We were still 100 yards away when the rocks rose slowly to their feet and began to wag their great white heads as they lumbered in to feed. My great-aunt Marie was a woman who had learned to see. She could read the landscape even through her shattered sky-blue eyes. She makes me train my own eye. She makes me write. My brother and I were the fourth generation on the Jordan Ranch, and we were in the community of Iron Mountain, which was 50 miles northwest of Cheyenne, 50 miles northeast of Laramie, on Chugwater Creek. Chugwater was 26 miles to the north. So it was pretty isolated. You know, it was all dirt road to Chugwater, and there wasn't much in Chugwater, so town for us was Cheyenne, and that was 50 miles away. When I was born, there was still 13 miles of dirt road. And then by the time I went to school, it was just 7 miles of dirt road. It was 7 miles of dirt road to the one-room school. And now it's paved all the way to the ranch house. The ranch was founded, or my great-grandfather came to Wyoming in 1887. He came from Maryland. And he worked for a fellow who was actually a cousin of his, out of his mother's family, a guy by the name of Collins on Chugwater Creek. And worked for him, and then Collins' wife wasn't very well, and she and the kids went out to California. There was thought the doctor said it would be good for her health, and they went out, as the way the story is told, they went out in a glass-bottom boat and it sunk and they drowned. And Collins was so distraught he killed himself. So at that point, he hadn't paid my great-grandfather for a couple years, and he took a mechanics lien out and then that's when the title to the nugget of what became the Jordan Ranch came into the family. So, you know, some long history there. And then it passed out of our family in 1978, and that was right during the financial crisis of the 70s, and so much land left family hands at that point. Interest rates were exorbitant. I mean, they went up, 15, 16% on a loan. And estate taxes at that time were exorbitant. There was, if I remember correctly, there was, I think, a $60,000 deduction, and then they accelerated very fast. So to pass a ranch from one generation to another, where it would be appraised for, on what it would sell for as real estate rather than on what it could produce as agricultural land, you just couldn't really pass from one generation to another. And my dad saw that coming. Some families have been able to really do a lot of lawyering and over a period of years and foresee that and act on that. That wasn't something my grandfather, who was, the old school, just, it wasn't something he was willing to do. So when he died, that meant that we had to sell the ranch to pay the estate taxes. And that just happened to family after family after family. It would be interesting to know, but it's a good little graduate project for some PhD student, but I have just instinctively, I bet as much land, if not more, passed out of family hands in the 70s as it happened in the Great Depression in the 20s and the 30s.
Did you grow up with the knowledge of that? Was that something your family was anticipating?
My dad really saw that coming, because he knew that Sonny wasn't gonna. He just wasn't willing to do that sort of planning, that sort of estate planning, and he knew that there wouldn't be a way to pass it down. So I did know, and I was prepared for that. My brother. It's so interesting with ranching and. You either really like that work from a really early age. You either want to be outside and you want to be with animals, or you really don't. And it just wasn't my brother's cup of tea ever. And he did it, but it wasn't something that he liked. I mean, and he got away as fast as he can. And I always just really loved it. And I think in a lot of families a lot of ranch families, there's the sense that a girl wouldn't inherit the ranch. I never felt that was true in my family. I really felt that Dad would have been very happy to pass it on to me, but he just didn't see a way to pay the estate taxes and keep the ranch. It just really couldn't have survived that debt. And in fact, it sold initially to a farm family out of Illinois, but they could not bear the debt burden, even though they'd sold a farm in Illinois and it had a big down payment, but they couldn't, and they lost it. And then it went to True Oil, which is a big Wyoming oil company that bought tons and tons of land in the 70s. And they were very cash rich, and all these ranches were going out of family hands, and they bought a lot. They ended up with two of the Iron Mountain had about 4 big ranches, fairly big, not by Texas standards, but good-sized ranches. Ours was one, and then 4 smaller ranches. And one of the other larger family ranches went to True too. So they really ended up with, a big chunk of that history and that land. And they're Wyoming, and they're responsible land managers. You hate to see it go out of your own family. I always just loved animals, and I just wanted to be with the horses. I really loved the cows. I didn't quite understand why I was born human instead of animal. I mean, I really didn't, and this just sounds so gross, but I wanted to eat. I would go and I would eat dog chow, or I would, lick in the salt licks or whatever. And I've actually met a lot of ranch kids who have a stage of doing that. I don't think I'm alone. And I was a sleepwalker, and I would, where my, when they'd realize I wasn't in the house, I'd be out in the barn. And they'd find me in this sort of semi-comatose state out there. But so I just really loved, that's my first sort of sensual memories are just the air and the smell of the barn and the smell of animals. I mean, to just, the way you lean into the neck of a horse and you just smell that salty, sweet horse smell, and that's really strong. And I think one of the things that I really value so much about growing up in that world is that it's really a family economy. Wendell Berry calls it home economy, and it really is a family economy. I mean, we all contributed to it. And we would go with my dad even when we were way too young to be useful. I mean, we'd ride in the pickup and get it. I think he was getting us out of Mom's hair. But from an early stage, we had roles on the ranch. One thing that I think is so hard to remember when these things start, but I don't think I was over 5 or 6 when he would pay us 50 cents a pound to pick up nails and welding rod and anything that could make a flat tire around the shop and around the buildings, and we'd gather that stuff and weigh it, and that was a lot of money, 50 cents. So even then, and that was actually, you have a flat tire and it's a couple hours of work, or depending on the situation, you have to run to town, which is, half a day or more than half a day to get to town and back. And so it was this small little task that really meant something. And then my brother's a year and a half older, as soon as we were old enough to be on our own riding, then we'd check the cattle in the summer while the men put up hay. The ranch was the Chugwater Valley, these really big, beautiful meadows with really heavy willow brush that was real excellent shelter in the winter. And in the 49 blizzard, for instance, which was this class, and it wasn't just one blizzard, it was this winter of blizzard after blizzard after blizzard, but whole herds across the Great Plains were wiped out. And we lost 8 cows before I was born. I just want to point that out. But our family just lost 8 cows because there was such good shelter in that brush. So it was a really good ranch. It worked really well. And these meadows, we'd have the cows down there in the winter and feed them, and they'd calve out down there. And then in front of the house were these bluffs, and up on top of that was what we called the top pasture. That was probably 5 or 6 sections. And we'd take them up there in the summer. And we had, then behind us were the hogbacks, and we had some land back there. Our reservoir was back there, and then we often leased some school section back in there too, so that'd be summer pasture as well. So my brother or I would go. There were 3 big pastures where we'd have cows, and we'd at least one day a week visit each pasture, and it would be a ride of 4 to 6 miles to get to the pasture, and then to really see every bit you could of a 4, 5, 6 section pasture. So they were long rides. And we knew it really mattered what we did. If we didn't see a sick bull and he died, that was a huge investment that was just gone. Or if we didn't move the bulls, if the end of the summer and they're all sort of hanging out in one corner talking about past accomplishments instead of thinking of business, and if we didn't see that, if we didn't move them back into the cows, it meant it was a cost to our calf crop. So we really had this sense pretty young that we mattered. And we also, when you're with your dad and working, I mean, he still can get mad, and my dad often did. But you know what the source is, and it's not mysterious. Like I think for kids whose fathers go out to work in the morning and come home at the end of the day tired and short-tempered, and they really don't know why. That's all they see of him is how frustrated he is at night when he comes home. Depending on the personalities involved, but in that situation, you understand that, and there's just the thrill of it too. It's just so exciting to end a hard day and know that you got it done. I really love having had the chance to grow up with that, to have that. And there's just a validation that I think is rarer and rarer, because there are fewer and fewer people who've been able to stay in family agriculture. Helen and I had the opportunity years ago with Gail Steiger and others in the Folklife Center to take cowboys over to Mongolia, and I really saw these with these herders over there. Their kids were just so involved in the work from such an early age, and these ranch kids or these Mongolian herders' kids, they just have a way about them that's really different than town kids, because they grow up with certain skills that matter, and they know they matter, and it's a really beautiful thing.
Did y'all have a cowboy or hired hand that worked for y'all, or was it strictly a family operation?
When I was growing up, there were 3 sets of buildings at the ranch. And when I was growing up, my grandfather lived in our house with us. And then full-time we had a cook and her husband who would work as a hand on the ranch. And then we had families at one end of the ranch, what was called the JT, and the other end of the ranch, what was called the AL. So we had 3 full-time hired men, and sometimes we'd have a 4th hired man in the bunkhouse. And then in the summer, they'd put on a big hay crew, and that'd be an additional 8. When I was growing up, 8 to 10 guys, and they'd come. And on our ranch, we never had any hired outside help that were women. I always worked outside, and a lot of women in Iron Mountain did. But I don't remember any women who were hired hands. That came later. But anyway, in the summer, we'd put on this big hay crew, and we'd have mowers and sweeps and stackers, and we put up mostly loose hay, and then would bale some for the windiest days where you just couldn't feed loose hay in the winter. But my cousin Donna, who is 10 years older, would come and help my mom in the summer, and she always had the young men who would come and work on the ranch in the summer were just these strapping young men, and I don't even know how they'd find our ranch, but There must, been a whole network. But I remember 2 college guys from Philadelphia. I remember a guy from England one summer. And Donna would always have these boyfriends on the hay crew. And, once I sort of got to the point where that started to seem sort of interesting, I thought, boy, my day is going to come. And interestingly enough, right then, Dad mechanized the hay crew. It just happened to correlate exactly with my puberty. It took me a long time to realize that might not have been entirely by accident. But the mechanization of ranching was really, when I still remember our last 2 workhorses, I never saw them work. They were retired. By the time I came along, it was all tractors and these great sweeps that were made by a wonderful machinist out of Wheatland, and hydraulic stacker, but it was all tractors and mechanized equipment. And then, right about that time, I was born in '55, so we're talking end of the '60s. Went to a windrower and a round baler and basically a 2-man hay crew. And by the time the ranch was sold in '78, it was just, my grandfather died, my brother was long gone, and I was in college, and year round it was just my dad and our foreman of many, many years and his son and his young family. So it was three people did year round what at one point, when my grandfather was still working outside, it was, my grandfather, my dad, 4 hired men, my brother and myself. And then in the summer, all this extra help. And then by the end, it was 3 people and did it all. So it was a big shift.
In 1994, Teresa Jordan edited a book of poetry written by ranch women that was entitled Graining the Mare. In the introduction to the book, Teresa wrote this: "When I look back on my childhood and young adulthood on a ranch in southeastern Wyoming, I realize that I knew early that women inhabited secret territories. I often had the sense of living in 2 worlds, a sense that is shared by many ranch women I know."
My great-aunt Marie had been born on the ranch where I was raised. And she just, from the day she was born, all she ever wanted to do was work outside, was to be with horses and cattle. And that was just her world, and she loved it. And then she married John Bell, and they bought the Iron Mountain Ranch, which was on the North Fork of Chugwater Creek. So as if you were riding or as the crow flies, it was, probably 6 or 7 miles away. Driving, it was 14 miles on the road. And my mom was different. Her folks were farmers in Nebraska, and she had never worked outside, and she wasn't an outside sort of person. And she didn't get along with horses, and she just wasn't involved in the outside work at all, except, if we lost a sweep driver, she'd drive sweep. But she was a full partner in the ranch, and she was she did all the bookkeeping, she did a lot of the hiring, running to town for parts, and just sort of keeping everything supplied and everything stocked, and they were fairly traditional roles, but it suited my parents. They really were a team. I really, people still talk about the relationship that they had, how they just really lit up in each other's company. And they both had come from difficult families. And they, my grandfather and my grandmother, my dad doesn't even remember him speaking to each other after he was 5 or 6. And when he was 10, my grandmother moved to town, and they never divorced, but they didn't get along, and he was a pawn, in the middle of that. And my mom's mom had been quite old when she was born, and became crippled right after my mother was born, and she blamed my mom for that. So both my parents grew up in families where they didn't feel loved. They didn't, and they just really found each other, and they wanted to create a different sort of family, and they were very intentional in trying to do that. My mom was actually really sick when both my brother and I were born. She had very difficult pregnancies and then was quite sick both times with anemia that kept her hospitalized for quite a while after. And I think that it was really hard for her when we were little. And I think that must have been really hard for her because she'd felt so rejected by her own mom, and she just wasn't really well enough to be the mom that she wanted to be. But she was definitely there for us. But she and I became really close when I was in my teens. And my brother and I went away to boarding school after the one-room school ended at 6th grade. And when I came back, I think it was probably after my 8th grade year, and I had hit puberty. And there was just, I think my mom hadn't been mothered very well. And I think that maybe as little kids, we probably perplexed her. She just didn't quite, she was a really involved and good mom. But I don't think that she enjoyed babies and young kids like some mothers do. But when I came back that one summer, and I just think we just, from that moment on, we were really, really close. And she was always so honest with me, really, about what she had gone through as a mom. And she never tried, her mom had been, and actually my dad's mom too, they both were sort of played the martyr card, we gave up so much for you. And that was something my mom just would never do. But she was really honest about what it was to be a mom. And she was very funny. She had a great sense of humor and very loving. She had as much as her relationship with her own mother was broken. Her brother was 25 years older than she. And he and his wife looked after my mom a lot. And there was a family friend who did as well. So she really experienced love growing up. And she was a loving person and very funny. But she always had an independence to her. She never wanted to define herself just through her kids. She loved to read. She loved ideas. She loved language. And I felt really supported by her. But I tell this story in Riding the White Horse Home, but I remember she'd been at, I can't remember if it was Stock Growers or Civic Leagues, something in town, and that everybody had gone out around and introduced themselves, and with one or two facts of their life. And one woman who was a friend, but she introduced herself. She said, and I don't even remember her son's name, but I am David's mother, And my mom came home that night, and she was telling me about this, and she just said, what does she read? It was just to define yourself fully through the role of your child. And her son was football captain and, had a lot of accomplishments. But that wasn't the way that my mom placed herself in the world. And it just, and I've always really admired that, because what she gave to me unreservedly. And I also really got to see her as a really self-aware and self-actualized person.
Teresa Jordan has done important work in her life to shine a light on the story of cowgirls and ranch women. In 1982, she published a book of oral history interviews with women of the American West that was entitled Cowgirls. In 1991, she gave the keynote address at the Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada, when the theme of the gathering was Family on the Ranch. The program for that gathering included quotes from ranch women. Here's one from Gwen Peterson of Big Timber, Montana. The attempt to include women on the ranch scene is either going to be Dolesville or open a can of worms we may never be able to stuff back in the container. Because if we ask women to speak up, we may find some of them speaking the truth, which may shake the whole mystique of glorious cowboys, let's all worship them. It will be frightening for the public and the cowboys to realize that women have been living and working in the West, doing the same chores and jobs as their celebrated male counterparts, the cowboys, plus doing all the usual women's work and wrestling kids too. How does one make scrubbing on a board till your hands bleed romantic and glamorous? Even so, we're proud to be ranch women. You couldn't pry us off the ranch.
Well, isn't it just so interesting, the circuitous path that any of us take to get where we are? I mean, I can imagine 10 years ago you wouldn't think you'd be, doing these interviews with people all over the West, about cowboy culture. And I was raised to know I wouldn't have a future on the ranch, and I was really interested in journalism, and I wanted to be a journalist in Latin America. I didn't start out at Yale, but I ended up transferring to Yale my junior year, and I transferred there in Latin American studies. I was there for fall semester. I came home for Christmas and went back to school, and about 3 or 4 days after I got there, I bought a bike and bought a bicycle to get around and made a good deal on it. I was really proud of my horse trading instincts in New Haven. Came home and back to my room, and my roommate said, your dad called and your mom's really sick, and he said to stay by the phone. Anyway, she had an aneurysm, and she died a week later. So it was really, all these years later, I still get emotional about it. And I went back, and my dad, and it was just after their 25th anniversary. She was 48 years old, and I went back, and then I insisted that I withdraw that semester from college. I mean, Dad was out there 50 miles from town all alone, and he just, he'd lost the only person he ever really trusted, truly loved him, and I was so close to her. It wasn't, I could say it was for Dad, but it was for me too. So he didn't, you cowboy up. You don't stop what you're doing, just, so he really didn't want me to withdraw. But he finally said, well, if you can take a full load of credits, if you can set up independent study, then you can come home for this semester. So I went back to school and told my professors what had happened. And I did set up one independent study in Mexican history. But the only way really I could, I was taking Spanish and all these things I just really couldn't do remote. But what I could do was take basically the equivalent of three classes worth of credits on my senior thesis. I'd really been drawn back there because they had a undergraduate senior thesis project, and I just really liked research. And so I went to my my advisor in Latin American Studies, and I said, what can I do from Iron Mountain? And he said, I just don't know how you can start your senior thesis from there. I'd planned to look at the press coverage of the massacre and the Olympics in Mexico. I think it was in 68. Anyway, that's what I planned for my thesis. And he said, I just don't think you can do that from there. He said, but why don't you consider doing something in Western history instead? And Yale had the preeminent department of Western history, which is sort of surprising it would end up in New Haven. But the William Robertson Coe collection of history had been offered to the University of Wyoming, but they would have had to build a building for it, and they didn't feel they could do that. So it went to Yale. And it was housed there, and the sort of dean of Western history was a professor named Howard Lamar. So I went to see him, and he said, well, we could do that. I would work with you on that. And we talked about some things, and one thing that I had been, because I had history and of the American West, and one thing that I had been really aware of was all that went on with farming during the Depression of the 30s, and really the agricultural depression was the 1920s and the 1930s. But I didn't know how it affected ranching. And, they're really different cultures. So I just said, well, that's, I'd be interested in that. And he said, well, I've never seen anything on that. So I went and I started, and so that I went back that semester, and I started going into the archives in Cheyenne every day, or 2-3 days a week. And would drive the pickup in and come back, cook dinner for my dad. And I just never had considered history in the American West. You grow up in the middle of it, and you sort of think you're a hick and and who would be interested in this? It's just the water you swim in. And so to even be introduced to this field of Western history, I just remember those weeks, and it was, both my father and I were just completely shell-shocked, But I just remember this sort of recognition that, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And so, it's just one of those strange things where this, probably the worst thing that I could imagine happened, and yet this other thing happened because of it. I would probably be living in Mexico or Colombia or who knows where right now, and anyway, I ended up switching my major. And that first semester at Yale, I had taken a seminar with a journalist out of New York, because I was still really interested in journalism. And one of the things that he had introduced us to was the work of Studs Terkel. And Studs Terkel was the Chicago radio host, and I mean, he's just such a hero of mine. And he interviewed everybody, and he was the first one that really let me know the incredible, extraordinary eloquence of ordinary people when they talk about things that they love. And we read, for this seminar, this book, Working, where he was interviews with, I don't remember, maybe 300 people from every walk of life. I mean, everything from a prostitute to a parking lot driver to a corporate executive. And it just was the fascination of people talking about their work, how passionate, how articulate, how deeply we think about what it is that we do. It just blew me away. And we had an assignment that we were supposed to go out and interview somebody and do a Studs Terkel type edited interview somebody. And then, so I interviewed a shoe repairman that worked on the edge of his little store was across the street from the edge of the campus. I mean, and he just told me amazing things. I just loved it. I mean, this is so embarrassing to admit now, but I was so shy I couldn't even tell him I was interviewing him, I just started asking him questions. And then I came home and I wrote that up and I turned it in, and I wish I could remember his name now, because he was so important. He's actually acknowledged in Cowgirls in the acknowledgments. But anyway, he really loved it, and he shared it with the class. And I just thought, oh my God, I just love this, So when I was working on this thesis on ranchers during the Great Depression, I did all this work in economics and in newspapers and all this, first primary source material. But I also did a lot of interviewing, and my great Aunt Marie was alive, and all these people from her generation, and they told me what it had been like, and the killing programs that went on. There was no feed for the cattle, so the government would come out and they would just, round up your cattle and kill them. And my great Aunt Marie and Uncle John, they had a slaughterhouse in Cheyenne. And things that weren't killed in the field, these cattle would be shipped into the Bell Packing Company. And they were so hungry, they'd unload these cars and they would have eaten each other's tails off, And it just, to the day she died, Marie would recall that, and she would just weep. It was just so hard to see that. So I started doing these interviews, and I just loved it, and to have this reason to sit down with people and to ask them all the questions you were told to never ask other people. It was just, it was like, oh my gosh, you can do this, and it was a wonderful, as I say, calling, recognition that, I really want to do this. And one thing that was going on right then, I graduated in 77, and this was really the big sort of paradigm shift in the history of the West. And before then, it had been the frontier thesis, and sort of the paradigm that looked at Western history was the paradigm of conquest, of the movement of white settlers across the country, and that the point of interest was the conflict with native people, with Hispanics and Spaniards coming up from Mexico, and it was very much the story told through the male white settler. And right at that time is a story, and that in history or in any field of knowledge, there's sort of a paradigm that the primary story that you tend to the other parts of the story tend to organize around, and it just sort of wears out after a while. And the frontier thesis had been the dominant idea in Western history for so long, and it just started to become very apparent that it left out so many other stories that had to do with the West as it actually formed. And just to give you an example, for instance, in histories of the West up to that point, there's almost no mention of the Mormons. The Mormons didn't fit that paradigm, because the Mormons came to stay, and they really came to build a community and this very communitarian extended idea, and theocracy didn't fit in with the sort of, so there's very little, it was like there was sort of no place to really interpret the Mormons. They're mentioned, and certainly they turn up as characters in Zane Grey novels and things, but the year I graduated, or maybe it was 1976, the year before, but a major textbook on the West was published, great big fat thing, and with an index in the back and this tiny, tiny print that went for page after page after page, and it listed the names of 3 women in that index. I mean, it was just like women didn't exist as individuals, and D. Brown, who was talked about in one of his books, and he was one of the first to really start to look at lives of individual women in the West. But he said they as individuals, they didn't cause much notice, but as a mass maternal force, they civilized the wild frontiersmen and allowed the settling of the West. And so it was just this very amorphous sort of even view of women. And that suddenly the scholarship grew up asking, well, what were lives of women like, and what were lives of wives like in polygamy? What were women lawyers? What were women doctors? What were the lives of Native American women, of Hispanic women? We started looking too at the individual histories of groups, like of the Chinese, and not just as laborers who built the railroad, but what the whole cultural interface between Anglo culture and this immigrant labor force. And it just put this lens that started, this shift of lens that started bringing into play all sorts of stories that just really hadn't been seen before. And I have this sort of idea, I mean, this awakening, and it really did change. It changed movies, it changed fiction. It just, all of a sudden, there's this new vitality in the stories that because they were stories that really hadn't been told and retold and retold. They were, oh my God, this was going on too. And I sort of had this vision of all these guys in the West waking up one day and saying, oh my God, there's a woman in bed beside me. I mean, it was. So anyway, I was looking at all this, and this was just happening there while I was in the Western History Department, and I was only there for 2 years, my junior and senior year. But it's really exciting, and reading lots of books, and just really wondering, and there were women homesteaders, there were ranch wives, but again, and there was Calamity Jane and some of the sort of wild women. But I grew up in this neighborhood where a lot of the women worked outside. They were really full partners in the labor, in the cow work and the horse work of the ranch. And I thought, well, was this just some quirk in this neighborhood where I grew up, or was this widespread? And so, I got to talk to my advisor and a couple of my other professors, and I was trying to decide what to do when I graduated. I'd been offered a job with Meredith Publishing out of the Midwest. They did Better Homes and Gardens and a bunch of magazines. And I thought, well, that sounded pretty good job. But I thought, I'm really loyal, and I know if I do that, I'm still going to be writing about people's bathrooms in 20 years. I just wanted to do something of my own first, sort of this idea of my mom, wanting something that was my own. So I thought, well, I'd love to do something on women on ranches, and talked to my advisors and said, could I get a grant or something? And they said, grants are really hard to get. I mean, you have to have a body of work really to get a grant, any grant that would give you any sort of major funding. But they said, why don't you talk to publishers? And this was just all of a sudden there was this interest in publishing for these stories that hadn't been told. So between 3 professors, I got the names of 4 editors in New York. And I was in radio all through college. I didn't even work for the paper. But I had my senior thesis, which had won the award for Western History at Yale that year, and I loved photography. And I had Hunter, who came to the ranch every year, was a photographer, a commercial photographer out of Iowa, and he'd help me get a camera and get set up in a darkroom. So I'd been taking these pictures, and I'd been really influenced by the WPA photographers, and I was taking all these pictures of ranch work and of ranch women. And when I went to see these editors in New York, and I was so dumb then, I mean, I had no idea how hard it was to get a book contract. If I had, I would never have gone, but I basically called them up and said, my name's Teresa, I'm from Wyoming, I want to talk to you about women on ranches. And they all just sort of said, well, yeah, we'll have lunch, so come to New York. I went to New York, I met with 4 editors. And I had these photographs, and I still to this day think the thing that really got my foot in the door was these photographs, because it was so immediate. They could look at these images and they could see things they'd never seen before. But the upshot was I got a contract from Doubleday. And so I graduated in 77. I got the contract in 78, and then Cowgirls came out in 82. And then I had to figure out how to write a book. But it originally was going to be this much more various, looking at women, ranch women in film and fiction and all these other things. But once I started interviewing, the interviews just took over. And it even though it has excerpts from other sorts of materials, it's really the heart of that is these interviews. And I did about 80 interviews. I had a little tiny Honda back when they looked like they should be on the sidewalk, and $20 Monkey Ward's backpacking tent, and I drove 60,000 miles across the West. And I would just sort of find, I'd see some woman working out, irrigating, and I'd crawl through the fence and ask her if I could interview her, and I'd go to the local history associations and ask them who was around, and one person would give me the name of another. It was very unsystematic. I mean, this was, believe me, not academic research. And these women told me the most amazing stories. And I think I can't remember, I think 28 of those interviews ended up being used in the book. My parents were great readers, and the house was, there were bookcases in every room, there were bookcases in the bathrooms, and they were, my brother and I, they'd always tell us, my dad would tell us a story at night, my mom would read us a story, and we were both precocious readers. We just couldn't wait to be able to bend back that cover and access the story ourselves. And so that was a really big thing. A dear friend, a novelist friend, Joyce Thompson, who was my first creative writing teacher after I'd graduated from college, and I remember a piece she wrote for a writing magazine one time saying that people were drawn to writing. Generally, there was a primary draw, and for some people it was story, for other people it was language. And the two go together, but generally there was, one was primary over the other. And I really think there's a third too, which is just the love of the book, the physical object of the book. And before I could read, I would cut up magazines and make my own books. I mean, they didn't make any sense, but I just loved the idea of creating an object of meaning, I guess. I wouldn't have exactly said it that way when I was that age. But so the idea of writing was planted early, and I felt that one way or another I would be a writer. It's funny, you have these little strange moments of recognition, but when I really knew that, when it just really formed for me, was this just strange little moment. I was an exchange student. I graduated a year early from high school, and I was an exchange student in New Zealand for a year. And there had been an exchange student in Cheyenne from New Zealand, a young man named Ian Wallace, and we'd been friends. And then his family had a cattle station in New Zealand, and they had me. I was in the North Island, they were in the South, but I stayed with them 2 or 3 times. And we were rounding up cattle, and I was on a young mare, and she fell. She tried to jump something, and she fell, and she landed on my back, and it broke some ribs. But anyway, it sort of knocked me out for a little bit. And I remember, when you sort of have been unconscious and you start to awaken, it's just this completely re-enchanted, odd world. And I remember I was in the tall grass. I remember this pink light in the grass, and just, not having any idea where I was or what had happened or anything else. And I just had this knowledge that I was going to be a writer. Where did that come from? Why did it come in that moment? But it was sort of from then on, I knew, it just was, that was weird. And I always thought it would be, research, journalism or research rather than creative writing. The only real artists in my family were on my mom's side. And her brother Jack's wife, Olga, was a writer, and she wrote both journalism and fiction. And then my cousin Donna, who was with us, was in art school. And so they were sort of, planted some ideas there. But I never intended to write memoir. And Riding the White Horse Home was not supposed to be memoir. It was supposed to be these, semi-academic essays about the issues of the West. And I started writing the first one that was going to be about rugged individualism. And I thought I would use family stories, but I thought they'd just be, little bits between much more sort of academic discussion. And I started writing the chapter that's Legends, that tells the story of the 4 generations of men in my family. And I told this story of my grandfather growing up with, being a little girl, and my grandfather wasn't really working outside anymore, and he was gruff, and he didn't like kids, and he didn't like cats, and every afternoon I'd play blackjack with him while the big cat slept on his lap. And just that sort of that story, that juxtaposition between the hardness that you had to project to the world and the softness of the heart within. And anyway, I started telling this story, and then he told me stories about my great-grandfather, and I got to thinking about him. And my great-aunt had given me these letters that my great-grandfather had written home. I started looking into them, and all of a sudden I was just into these family stories. And I wrote my editor, and I just said, you've got to stop me. I've just gotten off on this. And he said, if you can tell the story of your one family, you're going to tell all these. You're going to explore all these issues you want to explore. And he really pushed me towards memoir, doing that book as a memoir. And I really resisted that, and still have reservations about doing that. But he was right, and it wasn't just the stories of my family, it was the stories of that neighborhood, of these interrelated families. You asked me of some of my sensual memories of the ranch, or just the sense of being there. And, it was just such a beautiful land. And so somewhere I wrote something, the line of the bloodline formed by landscape, this landscape that connects us. But there was a place on the ranch I just loved so much called The Point. And I mentioned earlier that one of our big summer pastures was what we called On Top, and up at the top, this big rolling plains on top of the bluffs. And I would ride up there, take about an hour up there. And then if I wasn't, when I was done with my work, or if I had a little time, I'd just sit on this one point that jutted out particularly. And I would just look at the ranch, and I could see it all laid out, the the braid of the tributaries coming into Chugwater Creek, and the 3 sets of buildings. Our ranch ran about 7 miles along Chugwater Creek, and so this is a part where I'm talking about being on the point and looking out over those. It was the custom of many in the country to never carry water. Drinking, we thought, just made us more thirsty. The men chewed tobacco, but my father had taught me to put a small stone in my mouth. It gave the tongue something to work on, and thirst would magically disappear. I always looked for a particular type of rock, a pink quartz conglomerate, because I liked its feel, and I can still conjure its taste and its reassuring sense of moisture. I once dreamt that my teeth were made of such stones, and it was a comforting dream, as if the font of everything I needed, water and land, was right inside my mouth. That's what I felt on a larger scale from my viewpoint at the top of the breaks, that I had some direct connection to both the land and the events that transpired upon it. If I had only been to the point one time, I would never forget it. Such expansiveness shapes the synapses in irreversible ways. But I did not visit the point a single time. I went time after time, hour after hour. I thought I could always return. However vaguely I understood that every tribe and every family that had once called the Chugwater Valley home had been forced to leave, I could not imagine my own family moving on. I could not imagine that in 20 or 25 years I would remember the point from another life in another state, and that in the intervening years our ranch would have passed out of my family and into another, and finally into the hands of an oil company.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Teresa Jordan for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Teresa at teresajordan.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying the show and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron over at patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. That's patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. Or you can make a donation on the website, or you could take the time to write a review on the iTunes store, or simply tell a friend to listen to the show. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.